It was just another rainy afternoon in Pine Brook. But then a trembling bobcat kitten stumbled into the middle of Main Street, and fear turned neighbors into enemies as the crowd closed in with rocks and sticks. So a 12-year-old boy stepped forward, his small frame standing against an entire town, willing to risk everything to protect a life everyone else had already condemned. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. And if this moment grips your heart, like and subscribe for more true stories of courage, heartbreak, and hope. The mountains around Pine Brook always looked soft and blue in the rain, as if the world had pulled a cool, misty blanket over its shoulders. That afternoon, the drizzle fell with a stubborn persistence, beating on car roofs and soaking the cracked pavement of the tiny downtown square. People bustled about beneath umbrellas and hoods, their faces set against the wet chill, eager to get home before the storm got any heavier. The old clock tower struck 3 with a weary clang, barely heard over the steady hiss of the rain. It was just another gray day in Pine Brook, until the commotion started. At first, it was just a few sharp cries that sliced through the murmur of conversation. "Hey, watch out!" "What is that?" The crowd near the general store parted, and all eyes turned to the middle of Main Street. There, drenched and trembling, a small animal staggered along the yellow lines. It was little more than a bundle of soggy fur, with spindly legs and ears too big for its head. At a glance, it might have been a kitten, but there was something wild and wary in the way it moved, something not quite tame. The whispers began almost instantly. "That's a bobcat," someone gasped, voice thick with alarm. "Is it rabid? Where's the sheriff? Get it out of here before it hurts somebody." Within seconds, the nervous curiosity hardened into fear. People backed away, pushing children behind them as the little bobcat kitten crouched low, eyes wide and gold, body shivering violently beneath the relentless drizzle. One of the shopkeepers, Mr. Davies, grabbed a broom from his doorway. "Shoo! Go on git!" he barked, waving the broom with more bravado than sense. The kitten flinched, but didn't run. Rainwater streaked down its face, mixing with mud and something darker, a scratch, maybe, or just the grime of hard living. It looked impossibly small, far too delicate for a world this harsh. The panic spread like wildfire. Someone tossed a rock. It skittered off the wet pavement, splashing mud. Others joined in, their fear feeding off each other. The little bobcat darted from side to side, legs sliding on the slick road, searching for any escape. But the wall of shouting, angry humans boxed it in, leaving nowhere to go but back. Standing in the crowd, unnoticed and half-hidden behind a rusty pickup, was a 12-year-old boy named Ethan Miller. He wasn't shouting or waving or calling for the sheriff. Instead, he stood rooted to the spot, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes glued to the desperate animal. He saw the fear in its every movement, the wild, unspoken plea for mercy. Ethan had always been a quiet kid, the type who listened more than he spoke, the one who would rescue spiders from the bathtub and let them outside instead of squashing them. He knew the woods behind his family's cabin better than most of the grown men in town, could name every bird and every kind of paw print in the mud. He'd seen bobcats before, but only from afar. Silent shadows at the edge of dusk, gone as soon as you blinked. He'd never seen one so helpless, so heartbreakingly lost. As the shouting grew louder, Ethan's heart pounded in his ears. He wanted to scream at the others to stop, to let the kitten be. But the words stuck fast in his chest. The adults looked so big and certain, their anger justified by the sheer force of their fear. To them, it was just a wild animal, a threat, never mind that it was barely bigger than a house cat. The bobcat tried again to run, only to be chased back by another stone. Its paws slipped on the wet ground. It yowled in pain and panic, a sound that cut straight through Ethan's soul. He watched, horrified, as a teenager picked up a stick and jabbed it toward the kitten, driving it into a corner between two parked cars. "Don't let it near the kids!" a woman shrieked, pulling her daughter closer. "It could have rabies. Someone call animal control. Somebody get a gun, just in case." The panic was a living thing now, big and ugly, rolling through the crowd until even the bravest shrank back in disgust or fear. Ethan knew in a distant, shaky way that he should do something. He should walk away, let the adults handle it. That's what he'd been taught. Don't meddle, don't interfere, especially not when the whole town was watching. But his feet wouldn't move. He could see the bobcat's ribs heaving with each frantic breath, the way its claws scraped uselessly against the concrete. He saw its eyes, huge, golden, and desperate, locking with his for a single electric moment. In that instant, Ethan understood with absolute clarity that nobody else was going to help. If he didn't act, the kitten wouldn't last another minute. The rain fell harder, drumming against his hood. The world seemed to narrow down to just him and the little wild creature. The noise faded, the faces blurred, and all that remained was the sense that something important was happening, something he'd never forgive himself for ignoring. He clenched his fists, feeling the rough calluses of a summer spent building forts and fixing fences. He took a shaky breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped out from behind the truck. The townsfolk barely noticed him at first, too caught up in their collective panic. But as Ethan edged closer to the bobcat, his presence became impossible to ignore. Someone called his name in warning, but he didn't stop. He crouched low, hands out, voice soft and steady despite the tremble in his gut. "It's just scared," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The bobcat crouched lower, ready to bolt or attack. The rain poured down, soaking them both, turning the world to gray. Ethan met the wild kitten's gaze. He didn't see a monster. He saw a frightened, battered thing that wanted to live. All around him, the crowd shouted for him to stop, to get away, to let the adults handle it. But Ethan stayed rooted in place, every muscle locked between fear and resolve. For the first time in his life, he felt something bigger than himself stirring deep inside, a stubborn spark that refused to back down. In that small mountain town, on a drizzling afternoon, a boy and a bobcat stared each other down at the edge of chaos, and nothing in Pine Brook would ever be quite the same again. The tension in the air felt as thick as the storm clouds pressing down on Pine Brook. As Ethan took another cautious step toward the bobcat kitten, the sound of the crowd pulsed behind him. Warnings, gasps, the clatter of footsteps moving backward, as if mere proximity to this trembling creature was dangerous enough to send grown adults scrambling for safety. Still, none of that mattered to Ethan. In that moment, the world had narrowed to a single tunnel between himself and the wild, rain-soaked kitten. Then, suddenly, a rock flew through the air and landed just inches from the bobcat's tiny paws. The kitten recoiled, claws splayed on the slick concrete, eyes wide with terror. The adult's fear now found a cruel momentum. More stones followed, skidding and splashing, bouncing off the road, each one an exclamation point to the panic that gripped the crowd. Someone yelled for the sheriff. Someone else cursed the wildlife, muttering about rabies, lost chickens, danger. The bobcat spun in confusion, darting one way, then the next. Its every muscle screamed for escape, but everywhere it turned, it met only angry faces, Closed doors, heavy boots, and threats. At last, in sheer desperation, it squeezed beneath a battered old truck parked along the curb, vanishing into the shadowy space between muddy tires and dripping fenders. There, it cowered, pressed flat against the oil-stained gravel, heart pounding like a drum. For most in the square, that would have been the end. Let the animal hide, let it die or wander away, out of sight, out of mind. But for Ethan, something deeper had taken root. He couldn't leave the little bobcat there to face its terror alone. Each shouted warning, and every thrown stone had become a challenge, one that called to a part of him that refused to look away. Ignoring the hands reaching for his jacket, Ethan dropped to his knees in the wet, gritty street and crawled under the truck. Oil streaked his jeans. Mud seeped into his sleeves. The shouts behind him grew louder, adults ordering him out, neighbors pleading with him to stop, a chorus of disbelief and anger echoing in the narrow space beneath the truck's belly. Ethan's breath caught in his chest as he locked eyes with the kitten. For a split second, he saw only fear, raw animal terror that left the kitten frozen and trembling, fur matted and eyes huge with panic. But Ethan didn't reach out. Instead, he did the only thing he could think to do. He positioned his own small body between the bobcat and the world outside, making himself a living shield against whatever might come next. The kitten seemed to sense the shift. Its panic ebbed ever so slightly, though its body remained taut as a bowstring. They stayed like that for several long, tense minutes, boy and bobcat, trapped together in a greasy cave beneath the battered truck while the storm raged on outside. Eventually the shouts died down, replaced by angry mutters and the sound of retreating footsteps. Ethan could hear the voices above him. Mr. Davies calling him a fool, Mrs. Palmer lamenting how that Miller boy had always been trouble, others whispering about wild animals and weak parenting. Their fear twisted itself into contempt, as if Ethan's compassion had somehow made him less in their eyes. When Ethan finally crawled out from under the truck, he was soaked and filthy, but his grip on the world had changed. The townsfolk stared at him in disbelief, their gazes sharp and cold. He didn't say a word, just stood tall, his chest heaving with every nervous breath, refusing to meet anyone's eyes but keeping his chin high all the same. From that moment on, Pine Brook would never see Ethan Miller the same way again. Whispers followed him through the narrow streets and into the cramped aisles of the general store. Parents drew their children closer when he passed. Even his teachers at school eyed him with a strange new wariness, as if compassion itself were contagious, a foolishness to be avoided at all costs. The rumors spread quickly, warping and mutating with every retelling. Some said Ethan had tried to pet the wild beast and nearly lost his hand. Others claimed he was keeping the bobcat as a pet, endangering the whole town. The label stuck fast and hard, the foolish boy. Ethan felt it like a brand on his back every time he walked past the square, every time he caught his own reflection in the rain-speckled windows. But Ethan could not regret what he had done. In fact, he knew there was no turning back. He had made a choice beneath that truck, not just to protect a helpless creature, but to stand against the easy current of fear that ruled his town. That decision tied him, forever, to the bobcat's fate. If the kitten suffered, Ethan would suffer too. If it was cast out, so would he. As evening settled over Pine Brook, Ethan lay in bed listening to the thunder echo in the distance, wondering what would happen next. The town's anger felt as real and immediate as the storm outside, but so did his resolve. He knew the path ahead would be hard, that there would be a price for his compassion. But he also knew he couldn't change what he'd done. The line had been drawn, the choice made. Whatever the cost, Ethan would see it through. In the darkness, he thought of the little bobcat, still cowering in the shadows, relying on him for safety. And he made a silent promise. He would not let fear decide the future, not for himself, not for the wild, trembling creature that had changed everything in a single, rain-soaked afternoon. After that stormy afternoon, the rhythm of Ethan's life changed forever. For the first time, he moved through the town with a secret that pulsed beneath his skin, a responsibility far weightier than anything he had ever carried. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, mist curling over the mountaintops and soaking into the roots of every pine. Ethan's thoughts churned with anxiety, but he knew what he had to do. Just after dawn, while his parents still slept and the rest of Pine Brook's streets lay empty, Ethan crept outside. The world was hushed and waterlogged, puddles glinting on the blacktop and fog clinging to the corners of the yards. He glanced left and right, heart pounding, then slipped behind the old Miller house, where the weeds grew tall and untended. There, tucked behind a thicket of sumac and a crumbling stone wall, stood the abandoned garden shed, a squat, sagging structure that had once held tools but was now forgotten by everyone but Ethan. He approached quietly, listening for any sound that didn't belong. From within, a faint, hesitant rustle greeted him. He pressed his ear to the wooden door, heard the tiny, desperate breaths on the other side. Slowly, carefully, he pushed open the door and ducked inside. The Bobcat Kitten lay curled in the farthest corner, pressed against a broken flower pot. It looked up at him with wide, golden eyes, its sides heaving, fur spiked and wild. Mud and old leaves clung to its paws. Its tail twitched with nerves. Ethan's chest tightened at the sight of it. It looked so impossibly small, just a handful of wildness caught between terror and exhaustion. Ethan knelt down, speaking in gentle tones. Though his words were barely more than a whisper, he reached into his jacket and produced the offering he had smuggled from the kitchen, leftover chicken torn into small bites, wrapped in a napkin. The kitten's nose twitched. Hunger overwhelmed its fear for a moment, and it inched forward, wary but unable to resist. Its tiny jaws worked desperately as it ate, pausing every few seconds to look up, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. For a few minutes, Ethan allowed himself to believe he had done the impossible. He'd saved a wild creature from a world that had already decided its fate. He watched the bobcat eat and felt a flicker of pride. Maybe things would be all right now. Maybe if he just kept quiet and careful, he could protect it until it was strong enough to return to the wild. The shed, with its cobwebbed corners and thick blanket of shadows, felt like a fortress, a place where the kitten could heal and grow, unseen and safe from the prying eyes of Pine Brook. But hope, like mist, is quick to vanish in the face of reality. As Ethan moved through his morning chores, his mind kept drifting back to the shed. Each moment he was away, anxiety clawed at him. What if someone stumbled across the tracks he'd left in the damp earth? What if the kitten cried out at the wrong time? He jumped every time the phone rang or a truck rumbled down the street. That sense of dread only grew as the hours passed. By noon, whispers had begun to snake their way through town. Ethan heard them first at the general store, where Mrs. Turner leaned over the counter to murmur to Mr. Davies, her voice low but urgent. "I heard Miller's boy was seen crawling under a truck yesterday. Said there was a wild animal with him. A bobcat, maybe." Mr. Davies shook his head, but others in line turned to listen. "A bobcat? Here? That's trouble. Shouldn't be allowed." The words hung in the air, sticky as honey and just as hard to wash away. By the time Ethan made it home, the rumor had already twisted into something sharper, more dangerous. His mother glanced at him over her coffee, her brow furrowed. "Did you see anything strange yesterday?" she asked, voice gentle but probing. Ethan shrugged, muttered something non-committal, and busied himself with chores. But he could feel her gaze on his back, heavy with suspicion. All afternoon, Ethan replayed the scene in his mind. The kitten, the crowd, the shouts and stones. He knew the town's fear was growing, mutating with each retelling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Still, he clung to his secret, convinced that as long as he was careful, the bobcat would remain safe. As evening drew near, Pine Brook seemed to tighten around him. Every creak of the porch steps, every shout from the street, made Ethan's nerves jump. In the fading light, he slipped out again, sneaking scraps from dinner and a blanket pilfered from the laundry to line the cold floor of the shed. The kitten greeted him with a soft, pitiful mewl, no longer the wild, untouchable creature of yesterday, but something half domesticated by fear and hunger. Ethan sat beside it, knees drawn up to his chest, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "You're safe now," he told the kitten, voice trembling. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The kitten pressed closer, seeking the warmth of his palm. For a fleeting moment, Ethan believed the worst had passed, that kindness and secrecy could be enough to shield the fragile life he'd chosen to protect. But the world outside the shed was already shifting. Rumors were gaining momentum, carried on the wind and stitched into the fabric of small-town gossip. Parents gathered their children close. Men sharpened their voices and their suspicions. The notion that a wild animal might be hiding among them was enough to set Pine Brook on edge. And though nothing was confirmed yet, Ethan could feel the town's fear curling ever tighter around him. He knew, deep down, that he stood on the edge of something he could neither predict nor control. He just hoped his courage would hold long enough to see the bobcat through another day. Night settled over Pine Brook, heavy with secrets and the promise of coming storms. Ethan closed the shed door softly behind him, heart pounding, and slipped back into the shadows, unaware that tomorrow would bring a new crisis, one even his bravest hopes might not be able to withstand. The following days unfolded with a tension that grew thicker with each passing hour. Ethan tried to keep his routine as normal as possible, but everything felt different now, as if the whole town was holding its breath. Every sound outside his window set his nerves on edge. He'd never realized how closely people in Pine Brook watched one another, how every action was catalogued, dissected, and relayed in whispers that seemed to float on the misty mountain air. He'd grown meticulous in his efforts to protect the secret. He planned every visit to the shed with military precision, timing his slips through the backyard for the dead hours between chores or in the hush just before sunrise. Each time he would sneak a scrap of food from the refrigerator, pocketing a biscuit or a piece of cold chicken, anything that could fill the little bobcat's belly. He tried to erase his footprints behind him, brushed the grass with his shoes, kept his head down. The fear of being discovered pressed on him like a weight, yet he found purpose in it. For the first time in his young life, he understood what it meant to be responsible for another living thing, a responsibility made heavier by the knowledge that a single mistake could doom them both. Inside the shed, the kitten's transformation was slow but steady. It no longer flinched from his presence, no longer tried to flatten itself into the furthest corner. It ate with a growing hunger, even managed a tentative purr when Ethan's hand drew near. Sometimes, when the wind howled or a car backfired in the distance, the kitten would dart under the broken bench and freeze, but it always came back, eyes softening at the sight of the boy who fed it. To Ethan, these small victories felt monumental. Yet the world outside the shed was far less forgiving. Suspicion began to take root among the neighbors. His mother noticed food vanishing more quickly than usual, frowned at muddy boots left in the hallway, and asked sharper questions each day. "Where have you been, Ethan? You're always out back lately." He could feel the scrutiny from both parents, the unspoken worry settling around the dinner table. Still, he stuck to half-truths and shrugs, unwilling to betray his secret, but painfully aware of how fragile it was. Whispers began to swirl in the community. It started as idle curiosity. Someone saw Ethan slipping behind the house at odd hours. Another noticed the battered shed door moving when the wind was still. Before long, rumor hardened into certainty. "I heard he's hiding something out there," one neighbor muttered to another at the mailbox. "Probably that wild animal from the square." The fear that had ignited with the kitten's appearance was now aimed squarely at Ethan. The pressure mounted with every passing day. At school, classmates stared at him with a mix of awe and apprehension. Teachers watched him more closely, their patience thinning as gossip seeped into the classroom. He heard snatches of conversation behind his back, snickers, warnings, cruel jokes about Ethan and his wild pet. He tried to block it out, but the isolation stung. The friends he once played with after school now avoided him, their parents' warnings echoing in their behavior. At home, things grew even more tense. His father's voice became gruff, his patience shorter. His mother's concern shifted into frustration, her questions sharper, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. Ethan tried to reassure them, to hide the exhaustion that crept into his bones from sleepless nights and constant worry. But the wall of secrecy between them only grew taller. As the week wore on, the rumors turned into action. One evening, just as the sun slipped behind the mountains, a group of townsfolk gathered at the Miller front gate. There were faces Ethan recognized: Mr. Davies with his stern frown, Mrs. Palmer clutching her coat tighter, even the sheriff standing quietly to one side. Their eyes were hard, their voices low but urgent. Ethan watched from behind the curtain as the group approached the porch. His heart pounded so loudly he thought it might give him away. He saw his father step outside, confusion written across his face, and his mother hover behind him, eyes darting from neighbor to neighbor. The spokesman was Mr. Davies, holding his hat in both hands, voice grave and steady. "We need to check your property," he announced, ignoring the look of shock on Ethan's father's face. "There's talk of a wild animal, dangerous for everyone, especially the kids. We can't take chances." Ethan felt the world close in, every avenue of escape shrinking as the council pressed forward. His father tried to object, to demand an explanation, but the crowd was insistent. Fear had turned reasonable people into a determined, relentless force. They would not be swayed by logic or compassion. Ethan's legs moved of their own accord. He darted out the back door, heart racing, desperate to get to the shed before anyone else. He slipped through the yard, mud sucking at his shoes, adrenaline burning in his veins. The kitten's eyes met his as he burst inside, wild, confused, but trusting. Ethan scooped it up, cradling it to his chest, his mind racing with a dozen plans that all seemed destined to fail. Behind him, heavy footsteps pounded on the back porch. The unmistakable sound of fists banging against the door echoed through the house. Loud, insistent, impossible to ignore. Ethan froze, caught between terror and resolve. He pressed himself against the wall of the shed, clutching the kitten close, every muscle tensed as the voices grew louder outside. It was only a matter of time before the truth was dragged into the open, whether he was ready or not. The weight of the town's anger pressed against the thin, rotting wood of the shed as Ethan waited in the darkness, knowing the secret he had fought so hard to protect was about to be exposed. With the council's heavy fists echoing through the Miller house, the fragile world Ethan had tried so hard to protect was on the verge of shattering. He could hear his parents at the door, his father's voice rising, attempting to reason with neighbors, but the response was a chorus of worry and suspicion that made clear reason had little place in the storm of fear Pinebrook now harbored. Ethan crouched low in the darkness of the shed, the Bobcat Kitten pressed to his chest, both of them trembling. Every instinct screamed for flight, but he knew there was nowhere left to run. His mind raced back over the previous day, his desperate efforts to convince the world the kitten wasn't a threat. He'd shown it to two neighborhood boys he thought he could trust, hoping that seeing its tiny size, its raw nerves, would soften their hearts. Instead, the encounter had backfired terribly. The boys had drawn near, peering curiously at the wild animal Ethan swore was harmless. Startled by unfamiliar faces, the kitten arched its back, fur bristling, letting loose a hiss that sounded far larger and more menacing than its small frame. One of the boys stumbled back, screaming, and both had run off in terror, their shouts carrying through the backyards and into every house along the street. That moment had changed everything. The rumor now had proof, at least in the eyes of the town. Ethan's name was whispered in every kitchen, his actions dissected and retold until the story became a warning. The Miller boy was hiding a wild, dangerous animal. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now bubbled over, finding its outlet in the mob that now stood at his door. In the shed, Ethan's fear gave way to something harder, something fierce and immovable. He felt a heat rising inside him, an indignation at the injustice of it all, how a frightened, injured animal could become a monster in the eyes of those too afraid to look closer. He remembered the way the kitten's heart thudded against his palm, the trust in its golden eyes. He knew in that moment that he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. Footsteps thundered across the porch. There was the scrape of boots in the mud and the distant echo of voices arguing, his mother pleading for patience, his father insisting there was nothing to find. But the council was determined. They demanded answers. They called for the animal to be surrendered. "We can't let fear rule our town," someone shouted, and yet their actions spoke only of panic and anger. Ethan pressed his back against the wall, breathing shallowly, every sense alive with dread. He could hear the kitten's tiny mew, the tremor in its body matching his own. He remembered the rocks and sticks, the angry shouts, the way the crowd had closed in on something so defenseless and small. In that crucible, Ethan felt something change inside him, a shedding of the last layers of childhood innocence. He was no longer just a boy with a secret. He was a guardian, a protector willing to stand alone against the world if that's what it took. The voices outside grew sharper, their footsteps circling the shed. Without thinking, Ethan rose, clutching the kitten to his chest, and pushed open the door. The sudden movement startled the council, who stood in a semicircle, faces drawn tight with expectation. For a moment, no one spoke. They took in the sight before them. Ethan, muddy and wild-eyed, clutching the trembling bobcat like a lifeline. Behind them, more neighbors gathered, drawn by the noise, their faces reflecting a mixture of fascination and fear. Ethan's heart hammered as he faced them. He remembered all the times he'd watched others stand up for what was right. On TV and stories, in the small moments of real life that flashed through the years. He never imagined he'd be called upon to do the same. Not here, not like this. But there was no room for doubt now. The council demanded the animal. They insisted it was dangerous, that it needed to be trapped or killed for the safety of the town. Ethan found his voice small at first, then gathering force as it left his throat. He shouted above the gathering storm of voices, "If you want to kill it, you'll have to go through me first." The declaration hung in the air, stark and unyielding, cutting through the panic like a bolt of lightning. For the first time, the adults hesitated. They saw not just a boy, but someone transformed by his courage, someone willing to risk everything for a living soul that everyone else had already given up on. In that moment, the dynamic shifted. Ethan was no longer the foolish child to be pitied or scolded. He became something else entirely, a protector standing against a tide of fear. The townsfolk, caught off guard by his defiance, exchanged uneasy glances. Some muttered about stubbornness, others about soft-heartedness and children not knowing better, but none could bring themselves to move forward. As the tension hung between them, the storm clouds above seemed to gather, a rumble of thunder warning of worse to come. The crowd began to dissolve, drifting away in twos and threes, uncertainty now mingling with their suspicion. The council retreated, promising to return, promising that this wasn't over. But Ethan stood his ground, holding the kitten close, his breath coming hard but steady. He knew the fight wasn't finished. If anything, it had only just begun. That day, the boundaries of his childhood fell away, replaced by something fierce and unbreakable. Ethan was changed, and so too was the town, even if it would take Pinebrook a while to realize it. And as night fell once again, the shed felt less like a hiding place and more like a fortress, one built not of wood and nails but of courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that kindness was worth any risk. The aftermath of Ethan's defiant stand at the shed cast a long shadow over the following morning. His world shrank to the tight boundaries of fear and resolve. Word had spread. The Miller boy wasn't backing down, and neither, it seemed, was Pinebrook. The next day dawned with a tense, unnatural silence, as if the town itself was bracing for something inevitable. Ethan lay awake, heart hammering as he listened to the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, the air charged and restless. His parents barely spoke over breakfast. Their movements were stiff, marked by an anxiety that seemed to hover over the whole house. Outside, the distant rumble of thunder grew louder, the sky taking on a sullen, metallic hue. He slipped away from the table and crept out back, desperate to see the kitten. The bobcat greeted him with a weak mewl, hungry and frightened but alive, trusting only in him. Ethan knew now, with chilling certainty, that time was running out. The shed, once a sanctuary, now felt exposed, vulnerable. Every creak of the wood or shift of the wind sounded like footsteps coming to end this fragile peace. By midday, the council's ultimatum arrived. this time not with shouts and banging fists, but in the form of an official letter delivered to the Miller doorstep and read aloud in a cold, trembling voice. The words stung like icy rain. Within 24 hours, the animal must be surrendered or destroyed. If not, the town will take matters into its own hands. There was no more pretending, no room left for hope. The town's patience, fueled by fear, had finally snapped. Ethan felt the walls closing in, his options narrowing to a single, desperate path. He knew he couldn't outlast the anger of Pinebrook. If he stayed, the bobcat would be taken, or worse. The thought of that gentle, wild creature trapped or killed because of him was unbearable. But neither could he simply let it go into the woods alone. The kitten was too small, too weak. It needed a chance at real safety, somewhere far from Pinebrook, somewhere fear couldn't reach. That's when Ethan began to hatch his plan. If he couldn't protect the bobcat here, he would have to get it out. Out of the town, out of reach, and into the hands of someone who could help. He recalled stories he'd read at the Library of Wildlife Sanctuaries in the state, places where orphaned wild animals were cared for, healed, and sometimes released. It was a wild, impossible idea, but it was all he had. Ethan moved with a new urgency, preparing for the most daring thing he'd ever attempted. He gathered food, wrapped the kitten in a towel, and stuffed everything he might need into his old backpack. He thought about the logging roads on the far side of the woods, the ones rarely traveled, rough and rutted, but leading away from Pinebrook, toward the next county, and he hoped, toward Sanctuary. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Thunder cracked the sky, sending shudders through the house and rattling the windows. Sheets of rain hammered the roof, turning the backyard into a bog of mud and puddles. For most, the storm was a reason to stay inside, to wait and watch. For Ethan, it was both a curse and a cover, dangerous, but the only chance he'd get to slip away unseen. The wind howled as he crept through the back door, the kitten huddled inside his jacket, shivering against his chest. He moved quietly along the fence line, heart pounding so loudly he thought for sure someone would hear. He skirted the edge of the Miller property, ducked beneath sagging branches, and made for the woods. Each step felt like walking a tightrope above disaster. But nature, too, had its own plans. The farther Ethan pushed into the wild, the worse the weather became. Rain lashed his face, soaking him through, blurring the path ahead. The ground became a river of mud, each step a battle to keep from sliding. The storm was more intense than any he could remember. Lightning splitting the sky, thunder shaking the ground. At times, he had to stop and crouch behind trees, shielding the kitten from the worst of the wind, holding on to hope that they could make it just a little further. Behind him, the faint shouts of searchers reached his ears. The council hadn't waited for the deadline. Lanterns bobbed along the road, beams slicing through the storm in frantic, angry arcs. Ethan's fear reached a fever pitch. If he was caught now, there would be no more mercy. He pressed on, driven by desperation, his only guide the animal's frightened heart beating fast against his own. Mud sucked at his boots, and branches clawed at his arms, but Ethan didn't stop. He lost track of time, lost himself to the storm and the fight to stay upright, to stay hidden, to keep moving. His clothes clung to his skin, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The bobcat whimpered, burrowing deeper against him, trusting him utterly. And then, as if the world itself conspired to make the journey impossible, a tree crashed down across the path ahead, lightning still dancing along its shattered trunk. The woods lit up in stark, ghostly flashes. The way forward was blocked, the route back already lost. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen, battered by the wind, trapped by the force of nature and the fear chasing him. He looked down at the kitten, its fur plastered to its small body, eyes wide but alive. In that moment, Ethan understood that some things were worth any risk, any sacrifice. He would find another way. Even as the storm threatened to swallow them, he pressed forward, ducking under broken limbs, forging a new path through mud and darkness. He had become, in every sense, the kitten's only hope, and, in turn, its wild heart was the only thing giving him strength. The storm raged on, erasing all traces of what came before. Behind him, Pinebrook waited, convinced it had done what was necessary. But out in the wild, through wind and mud and terror, a boy and a bobcat fought on, not just for survival, but for the stubborn, impossible chance that kindness might yet win. The storm's fury didn't let up as Ethan pressed onward, forging his own path through the tangled woods that bordered Pinebrook. Rain lashed the earth with such force it felt almost punishing, transforming the narrow game trails into rivers of mud and forcing him to navigate by instinct rather than sight. Branches whipped his face. Each lightning flash made the shadows leap and dart, revealing glimpses of a world made unfamiliar by wind and darkness. He clutched the Bobcat Kitten close, feeling its shivers vibrate against his chest, its small body a warm and fragile anchor. Every few steps, he had to stop and check the kitten's breathing, reassuring himself that it was still alive, still trusting him to find a way out of the chaos. The storm was the kind that erased all sense of time and place, turning the world into an endless, sodden ordeal. Suddenly, a sharp cry tore through the howling wind, softer than thunder, but more urgent than any sound Ethan had heard all night. The kitten, spooked by a flash of lightning, wriggled free of his arms and bolted into the storm. "No!" he managed to gasp, but the word vanished into the rain, unheard by any but himself. Ethan's heart stopped. Panic clawed at his throat as he watched the small, dark shape disappear between the trunks and tangled undergrowth. He could barely see 3 feet ahead, the rain now a silver wall that drowned out everything but the thud of his own pulse and the far-off crack of thunder. He lunged after the bobcat, crashing through brambles and sliding down a bank so slick it felt more like ice than mud. Water surged around his ankles, cold and insistent, tugging at his legs as if trying to drag him down. The beam of a flashlight bobbed distantly through the trees, accompanied by the shouts of townsfolk and the bell-like clang of a warning cowbell. Ethan's feet found purchase on a submerged log, and he pushed forward, adrenaline masking exhaustion. He called out, his voice swallowed by wind. The woods seemed endless, and every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to seek shelter. But all he could think of was the kitten, lost, terrified, and alone in a world that already wanted it gone. He spotted it at last, huddled at the edge of a makeshift animal trap set by one of the men from town. The trap was crude, a steel snare set into the mud, barely visible in the shifting, watery light. The kitten, sensing the danger, froze, its wild eyes wide and luminous in the storm. Ethan didn't hesitate. He plunged into the mud, sliding on his knees and catching himself just inches from the trap's cruel jaws. The water surged around him, soaking through every layer, numbing his hands and feet, but he stretched out, calling softly through clenched teeth. The kitten inched backward, its tiny body trembling, ears flattened by terror and rain. The current grew stronger, a sudden surge sending Ethan sprawling face first into the mud. For a split second, all he knew was cold and darkness, the roar of the storm in his ears. Then he was up again, hands grasping, refusing to let go. He reached the kitten, wrapping his arms around its slick body, pulling it safely away from the snare just as another bolt of lightning lit up the woods. From the edge of the clearing, a cluster of lanterns and flashlights bobbed. Faces appeared out of the dark. Townsfolk drawn by the commotion, their shouts turning from warning to shock. They watched as Ethan, covered in mud and shivering uncontrollably, clutched the wild creature to his chest, his body half submerged in water and debris. In that suspended moment, everything changed. The townsfolk saw not a wild beast threatening their safety, but a child risking everything to save a helpless life. They saw Ethan not as a fool or a troublemaker, but as something braver, a protector driven by empathy and the refusal to abandon something in need. A hush fell over the crowd, the fear that had festered for days now crumbling in the face of undeniable courage. Ethan barely registered their presence. All that mattered was the fragile heartbeat against his ribs and the knowledge that for at least one more night, the kitten was safe. Someone waded into the water, pulling Ethan and the bobcat to the shore. He stumbled to his feet, legs shaking, cradling the animal close. The storm still raged, but in that clearing, time seemed to pause as the townsfolk took in the scene. The boy, battered by the elements, refusing to let go even as exhaustion threatened to pull him under. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Faces once set in suspicion softened with something like understanding. The sheriff, lantern held high, surveyed the mud-splattered boy and the trembling animal, then turned to the others, the hard edge in his gaze replaced by something quieter, more searching. For Ethan, the relief was overwhelming, but so too was the weight of what had just happened. He collapsed onto the wet grass, the kitten curled against his chest, both of them breathing raggedly. Alive but forever changed by the storm and by each other. The town, too, was changed, if only for a moment. The vision of a frail boy clutching a wild kitten against the storm, willing to risk everything for a soul no one else wanted to save, lingered in every heart that witnessed it. The fear that had seemed so justified now felt small and mean in comparison. Above them, the rain began to ease, the worst of the storm passing, leaving behind a battered but unbroken silence. And in that hush, Pinebrook faced a new truth. One brought not by anger or suspicion, but by the fierce compassion of a single boy who would not let go. When the storm finally relented, it left Pinebrook in a state of muddy exhaustion. The streets were rivers of brown water. Yards were strewn with debris and branches torn from the old oaks, but no mess compared to the tangle of emotions swirling through the hearts of everyone who had witnessed what happened at the edge of the woods that night. Even as dawn broke, a sullen, golden light barely piercing the clouds, the town seemed quieter than usual, humbled by what they had seen. Ethan, for his part, was barely conscious as he was dragged from the floodwaters. His limbs felt leaden, every muscle quivering with fatigue and cold. Mud clung to his hair, his jacket, even his eyelashes. The Bobcat Kitten was nestled against him, shivering so hard it seemed to vibrate, but alive, miraculously, improbably alive. Someone had thrown a blanket over Ethan's shoulders. Another person pressed a towel into his hands, but all his senses were fixed on the small life in his arm. He staggered toward the fire truck where a paramedic tried to examine him, But Ethan wouldn't let go of the kitten. He cradled it as if it were made of glass, shielding it from every outstretched hand, every well-meaning adult who didn't understand what they were asking him to surrender. In that vulnerable, half-awake state, Ethan could only focus on the bobcat's warm breath on his wrist, its tiny claws kneading his sleeve, the soft, desperate way it burrowed closer as if seeking a mother's warmth. The wildness was still in its eyes, but the fear had given way to something gentler, a quiet trust that cut through the fog of exhaustion. The crowd had gathered at a respectful distance now, their anger spent, their curiosity muted. Some watched in silence, ashamed of their earlier words. Others whispered to one another, unable to reconcile the image of the dangerous animal with the fragile, trembling thing clinging to the boy's chest. The storm had washed away more than branches and fences. It had stripped the town's fear to its roots, leaving only truth behind. Ethan's parents arrived, faces drawn and pale with worry. His mother reached for him, but Ethan shook his head, unable to let go of the kitten. Tears streaked her cheeks, tears of relief, of regret, of something more complicated she couldn't put into words. His father stood by, one hand resting gently on Ethan's back, unsure what to say, his silence saying everything. The sheriff stepped forward, clearing his throat, his authority softened by the events of the night. He crouched beside Ethan and looked him in the eye, searching for anger, for blame, but finding only the steady gaze of a boy who had risked everything for a fragile, frightened life. The sheriff placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, then turned to the crowd, letting silence speak louder than any order. Gradually, people began to drift away, the tension dissolving into a weary acceptance. Some murmured apologies, others simply nodded. The lesson was heavy in the air. It was their fear that had almost cost an innocent life, not the animal itself. In the days to come, many would struggle to admit that out loud, but no one would forget the image of Ethan, half drowned and shaking, defending something small and helpless from the world. For Ethan, the price was more than exhaustion or a scolding from his parents. He felt as if something inside him had shifted permanently, some boundary crossed that could never be returned to do. He understood now, in a way only the hardest lessons teach, that doing what is right comes with a cost. Protecting the weak, defending the innocent, it demanded more than courage. It demanded sacrifice. It meant being willing to stand alone, to shoulder the consequences, to carry the scars even when the world moved on. That night, as he lay in bed wrapped in layers of blankets, Ethan's mind raced with memories. The cold bite of the storm, the shouts of the townsfolk, the flash of lightning revealing the trap, the kitten's heartbeat under his hand. He shivered, not from cold, but from the weight of what he had learned. He glanced over at the kitten, curled up in a cardboard box beside his bed, breathing deeply, finally asleep. The house was quiet, but Ethan sensed the change even there. His parents no longer questioned his actions. They had seen what the others had seen. They watched over him and the kitten, wordlessly joining him in his quiet vigil. For the first time in days, Ethan allowed himself to rest, not because the world was suddenly safe, but because he knew he had done what he could. The rest was out of his hands. Outside, Pinebrook seemed changed too. Neighbors who had once whispered suspicion now brought hot soup and dry towels, speaking in hushed voices of second chances and forgiveness. The kitten became a symbol, not of danger, but of the fragile line between fear and compassion and the risk it took to cross it. But for all that had shifted, Ethan's innocence was lost. He understood now that standing up for what is right can be lonely work. It means facing down not just storms and danger, but also the harder, quieter battles against misunderstanding, against suspicion, against the easy comfort of going along with the crowd. He'd faced the world and chosen kindness, but he knew deep down that choice would forever set him apart. And yet, as the kitten pressed closer in the night, seeking warmth like any house cat might, Ethan felt no regret, only the knowledge that, no matter the price, some things were always worth fighting for. The aftermath of the storm and that long, harrowing night left a quiet mark on the town. As the clouds slowly lifted and sunlight broke through the soaked treetops, Pinebrook seemed to breathe differently. The fear and suspicion that once clung to every neighbor's face had faded, replaced by a thoughtful hush. Even the gossip, so often the lifeblood of the small community, grew gentler, the edge of blame dulled by the memory of what they had witnessed. For Ethan, life moved forward in a way that felt both strange and inevitable. He was no longer just a boy with a secret, nor the foolish child the town had whispered about. Instead, he found himself at the center of careful, respectful attention. People stopped him on the street, some with nods of approval, others still searching his face for the wild defiance that had marked him during those tense days. His classmates, once wary, now eyed him with a curious mix of awe and sympathy. If there were still jokes or sideways glances, they no longer hurt the way they once had. The ordeal had reshaped him from the inside out. The Bobcat Kitten, for its part, began to recover with astonishing speed. With every passing day, its strength returned. It ate eagerly from the saucer Ethan left each morning, growing more curious, exploring the corners of the house with cautious steps. There were moments when Ethan would catch it staring through the window at the forest, eyes bright with longing, the call of the wild still strong despite the safety and comfort he offered. But everyone understood, even if it hurt to admit, that a house was never meant to be a permanent home for a creature like this. The kitten was not a pet, nor some prize to be won through courage. It was a wild thing, belonging to the world beyond fences and walls. Ethan felt the weight of that truth each time he stroked its fur or felt its gentle purr against his palm. Compassion, he was learning, wasn't always about holding on. Sometimes it meant letting go and doing so with love rather than regret. The decision, when it came, was made quietly, as if the town itself had been turning the idea over in its collective mind. The council met, this time without the heated arguments and raised voices. The sheriff approached Ethan's family with a proposal. The kitten would not be destroyed, nor put on display as a curiosity. Instead, arrangements were made to send it to a wildlife sanctuary, one equipped to care for orphaned bobcats, a place where it could grow, heal, and perhaps, one day, return to the wild where it belonged. The day of farewell was cool and bright. The whole town gathered at the Miller home, no longer a mob driven by fear, but a community touched by something larger. There was no grand speech, only quiet support, and the simple presence of neighbors standing together. Ethan carried the bobcat out to the waiting van, its body pressed against his chest, warm and alive and trusting. He felt a lump in his throat, a bittersweet ache of pride and sorrow intertwined. He knelt to say goodbye, feeling the soft brush of fur against his hand. The kitten looked up at him, wild eyes softening for just a moment, And Ethan knew it would remember him, in whatever way wild animals remember. As the van door closed and the engine rumbled to life, Ethan's eyes filled with tears, of loss, of relief, of something like hope. He stood there, watching until the van disappeared down the road. Around him, the townsfolk remained silent, heads bowed. No one rushed him. The lesson had reached all of them. Real courage is not just standing up to fear, but knowing when to let go for the good of another. Pinebrook would never see wildness the same way again. Nor would it be as quick to judge the actions of a child guided by compassion. That afternoon, the sheriff found Ethan sitting alone on the porch steps, looking out over the yard, where the grass was finally beginning to recover from the flood. The man sat beside him, silent for a long while, then squeezed Ethan's shoulder, acknowledging in that brief gesture the weight the boy had carried and the respect he had earned. As days passed, Ethan returned to his routines: chores, school, evenings spent wandering the wood's edge, listening to the birds and the rustle of wind through pine needles. But he was changed, and so was Pinebrook. Neighbors now checked in on one another, not just out of suspicion, but genuine care. Rumors were met with questions, not accusations. The memory of the storm, and of the boy who had refused to let fear decide his actions, became a quiet legend, retold in softer voices. Ethan often found himself staring at the forest, wondering how the bobcat was doing, imagining it prowling through tall grass or napping in a patch of sunlight, unafraid and free. He missed the small presence in his room, the weight curled against his side at night. But he knew he'd done the right thing, even if the right thing hurt. Looking back, he understood what he'd gained was worth more than any comfort lost. Compassion is not weakness, he realized. True strength lay in doing what others were too frightened to attempt, in standing alone when necessary, and in stepping aside when it mattered most. Pinebrook, for its part, learned to look beyond old fears and to measure its worth not by what it protected, but by whom it protected, however small, wild, or misunderstood that life might be. And so the story of a boy and a bobcat became something more, a reminder that kindness, even when costly, always leaves the world a little better than before. Time moved on in Pinebrook, but the story of a frightened wild kitten and the boy who stood by its side did not fade as quickly as other dramas. In the weeks and months that followed, the memory rippled through the lives of everyone who had been touched by those storm-swept days. The marks left behind were not just scars on the landscape, muddy ruts in the grass, broken branches leaning against fences, but subtler, stitched into the spirit of the town itself. Ethan felt it most keenly in the quiet spaces of his own life. In the cool mornings before sunrise, as he wandered the dew-bright backyard with his hands in his pockets, he still expected to see a pair of golden eyes watching him from the shed's shadow. Sometimes he'd find himself saving scraps from dinner, his hands moving automatically, before remembering there was no small, wild mouth waiting to be fed. The ache in his chest was sharp, but not bitter. Instead, it was the kind of ache that reminded him of growth, the feeling of having carried something precious, then letting it go when the time was right. At school, his classmates watched him with new eyes, the teasing and whispers replaced by awkward admiration. The story had become part of Pinebrook's shared history, retold around dinner tables, in classrooms, and at the general store. The boy who had been labeled foolish for his kindness was now quietly respected. Other children sometimes approached Ethan, telling him about strays they had helped, or asking him for advice when they found an injured bird or squirrel. He listened, nodding, never turning away, his own hard-earned understanding shaping his words. For the adults of Pine Brook, the events had planted seeds of change. Neighbors who had once eyed each other with suspicion now found themselves reaching out, sharing food, offering help with repairs, watching over children playing in the newly cleared lots. The council, which had once gathered at the Miller door in anger, now met to discuss ways to support both people and wildlife, exploring programs for education and humane coexistence. The sheriff, in particular, made it a habit to check in on families who might need a gentle word or a helping hand, remembering the consequences of fear left unchecked. There were still moments of resistance. Old habits and old worries don't vanish overnight. But a new current of courage and empathy moved beneath the surface of daily life, guiding choices in small, steady ways. Pine Brook, shaped by its ordeal, began to look outward rather than inward, measuring its strength by its willingness to protect the vulnerable, even when it was difficult or unpopular. For Ethan, the greatest lesson was not just the rescue itself, but what came after. He learned that courage did not mean the absence of fear, but the determination to move through it. That compassion sometimes meant standing alone. That letting go, though painful, was a form of love all its own. He sometimes received updates from the wildlife sanctuary, a postcard with a photograph of a growing bobcat, sleek and strong in the dappled sunlight, its eyes wild and proud. The notes always included a thank you, a quiet recognition of what his actions had set in motion. Those images became treasures, kept tucked inside his desk, reminders of what he'd done and how far the kitten had come. As the seasons changed, the story of Ethan and the bobcat took on a life of its own, echoing through town events and family gatherings. When storms rattled the windows or wild animals wandered close to the edge of the woods, parents spoke of the time Pine Brook had faced its fear and chosen kindness instead. The narrative wasn't grand or loud, but it grew, woven into the very way the town understood itself and its future. On the anniversary of the rescue, the school held an assembly, inviting students and parents to share stories of moments when they'd chosen compassion over fear, sometimes for an animal, sometimes for a person, sometimes for themselves. The courage of a single boy had become an invitation for others to step forward, to examine their own hearts, to reflect on what kind of community they wished to build. And so, as the narration of this story closes, the voice that once chronicled only Ethan's journey now opens outward, reaching through the page or the speaker, inviting anyone listening or reading to pause and consider. One ordinary boy taught an entire town that compassion is stronger than fear. He faced a storm and a wall of angry neighbors, not because he was fearless, but because he cared too much to do nothing. He saved a fragile life, and in doing so transformed his own and those around him. But what about you? If a vulnerable life, animal or human, needed your protection tomorrow, would you choose fear or would you choose kindness? What would you do? In that question, the story finds its truest meaning, not in the details of the storm or the rescue, but in the challenge it leaves behind. The challenge to look for moments in our own lives when courage is needed, when compassion can make a difference, when standing up for what is right means standing apart. It's a call to action, quiet but insistent, echoing in the hearts of anyone who hears it. And so the tale of Ethan and the wild bobcat lingers in Pine Brook and beyond, not just as a memory, but as a promise. that every act of kindness ripples outward, shaping the world in ways we may never fully see. That every choice to protect, to risk, to love, leaves the world better than we found it. And that the story is not yet finished, because the next chapter is yours to write.